I'm the middle of three boys. I've got an older brother and a younger brother. Both of them grew up doing Scouts. My older brother made it all the way to Eagle Scout. My younger brother started Boy Scouts too, but quit somewhere along the way. For whatever reason, though, my parents never pushed me into it when I was a kid. That always felt strange to me, because I clearly remember being jealous of my older brother, Scott, whenever my mom dragged me along to Pinewood Derby events and Scout celebrations and all that. But the thing I envied most wasn't the trophies or the badges, it was the campouts, when the troop would head off into the woods and spend the whole weekend out there. I wanted to be part of that more than anything. A couple times I went along just for the drive, and I remember seeing them unloading gear, setting up tents, lighting fires, doing all the stuff I thought was the coolest thing in the world. But I was younger, and I wasn't actually in the troop, so I couldn't stay. I had to go home with my parents. Most of that jealousy centered around my older brother, because I grew up watching him get ready for these trips. Before every campout, he'd bring a tent home and practice putting it up in the backyard. I was probably 7 or 8 at the time, and I remember so clearly how excited I got when I came up with the idea that we should do our own little backyard camping night. Basically, I wanted us to set up the tent outside and sleep in it overnight. To me, that felt like the greatest plan ever. Our yard also wasn't really what most people picture when they think of a backyard. Our house was in one of those big open neighborhoods where people's yards kind of blended together and there weren't many fences. Instead, there were clusters of trees and brush between properties, which made everything feel even more like being out in the woods. Our yard was huge too, and we had a fire pit. My parents leaned into the idea and helped us get a fire going so it would feel like a real camping night. My little brother hung out with us roasting marshmallows too, but there was no way my parents were letting him sleep out there. He was only 4, and at that age it obviously wasn't happening. He wasn't a scout either, not that it mattered, because he was literally 4. After it got later, my parents brought him back inside and told us it was time to get ready to sleep. At that point in my life, the Game Boy Advance SP was everything. So once Scott and I got into our sleeping bags, we both pulled out our Game Boys and started playing. I was playing Super Mario Bros. 2, which I was completely obsessed with at the time, even though I could never actually beat it. After a while, I started getting tired and rolled onto my side, trying to fall asleep. But I remember not being able to. I was tired, but I couldn't get comfortable. Maybe it was because I'd never slept in a sleeping bag before. Honestly, it just wasn't comfortable at all. A long time passed before I finally drifted off. When I woke up, I was disoriented for a second and didn't immediately know where I was. I looked around the dark tent, and then I noticed Scott was gone. His sleeping bag was empty. The zipper to the tent was still closed, though. I figured maybe he gave up and went back inside because he couldn't sleep either. The second I realized I was alone out there, I got scared. I didn't want to be in the tent by myself anymore. So I got up and started to unzip the tent, but before crawling out, I did that little cautious peek through the opening first, because I was still a kid and didn't want to just go tearing through the backyard without checking if everything was safe. It wasn't. There was someone sitting by the fire pit in the dark. It wasn't Scott. It was a grown man. He was facing the tent, and there's no way he didn't see me looking out. I gasped, zipped the tent shut again, and scrambled back into my sleeping bag like that thin layer of fabric could do anything to protect me. I stayed totally still. Inside the tent, it was almost pitch black, except for a faint gray glow from the moonlight filtering through the fabric. I don't even know exactly what I was thinking at that point, but I do know I wanted to call out for my dad. A part of me was desperately hoping it somehow was him, but I knew it wasn't. I had seen enough of the man's face even in the dark to know it wasn't my dad, and if it had been, he would have reacted when I poked my head out. Then I heard the chair by the fire pit scrape slightly. I froze, praying he wouldn't stand up, and if he did, that he wouldn't come toward the tent. Then I saw his shadow fall across the side of the tent, blocking part of the moonlight. He was right outside. I remember thinking that if I stayed completely still, maybe he'd think the tent was empty. Then I heard the zipper begin to move. It was slow, painfully slow, just that dragging sound as it came down a few inches. The opening was tiny, but it was enough. I couldn't help it. I turned my head just a little. There's that small gap at the bottom of a lot of tents where the zipper doesn't fully close. I had never noticed it before that night. There was an eye pressed right up against that gap, just one eye staring directly at me. I could see the white of it in the darkness. For a few seconds, I couldn't even scream. I was completely paralyzed. Then the eye narrowed slightly, like the person was smiling behind the tent flap, even though I couldn't see his mouth. The zipper moved a little further. That was when I finally screamed. I scrambled backwards, kicking out of my sleeping bag and knocking into the tent poles. Immediately, I heard footsteps sprinting off through the yard. Then the back porch light snapped on, and I could see the glow through the tent fabric. My dad burst through the back door yelling. I could hear him running across the grass, but by the time he got to the fire pit, whoever had been there was already gone. Of course, my parents called the police. I don't remember everything that happened after that. I know my mom took me into my parents' room, and at some point the police came and searched around outside. The whole thing was a complete nightmare. I slept in my parents' bed that night. For a while after that, I was pretty shaken up. I was a kid, but even then I knew how close something bad had come to happening. And then, just when things were finally starting to feel normal again, maybe a few weeks later or a month later, something happened that locked the whole experience into my mind permanently. I went to Catholic school, and during lunch, we had a short recess in the schoolyard, which was basically all concrete. At the far end of the yard, there was a fence facing the street. We were playing some game, maybe red light, green light, or something like that. I genuinely don't remember. All I remember is that I had to run to the fence to be safe in the game, so I ran over there and stood by it with a few other kids. Then a man's voice said, "Hey," from the other side of the fence. I turned and saw a man standing there asking me for directions to some place I don't remember now. I told him I didn't know. We weren't supposed to be talking to strangers outside the schoolyard anyway. Then he said, "Your name's Chris, right?" That moment is burned into my brain. His voice, his face, the way my stomach dropped. I told him no. I lied. Then he smiled and said, "You don't remember me, do you?" At that point, I ran straight toward one of the recess monitors and pointed back to the fence, but by then, the man was gone.
One of the kids next to me said he saw the man too. Recess got ended early. The school called my parents and I got taken home before the day was over. I was sure it was the same man from the backyard. My parents were terrified after that. I remember how stressed and sick with worry they seemed. It was a horrible stretch of time. We lived in a really nice neighborhood too, which somehow made it feel even more surreal. For months after that, my parents kept me under close watch. Eventually, life went back to normal, at least on the surface. But even now, it still hurts to think about, because I know how easily I could not be here. If that man had gotten what he wanted, I might have disappeared that night in the tent, or later outside the schoolyard. And what makes me feel the sickest is wondering whether he ever succeeded with someone else.
I grew up in Salem, Oregon, which always felt like one of those small, comfortable towns where things were mostly calm. I moved out when I was 21 and bought my first house about 50 miles away. Since it was my first place, I furnished it however I could, with a mix of stuff from my parents, some things from their friends, and a bunch of used stuff I found online. At the time, I was driving a Ford Raptor, which made hauling furniture and bigger items around pretty easy. One day, I found a listing on Facebook Marketplace that looked almost too good to pass up. It was one of those posts where someone is basically selling a bunch of random stuff, like an online yard sale. The two things that immediately caught my eye were a cream-colored sectional couch that looked almost brand new and a Cannondale mountain bike. I didn't own a bike at the time, and because of where I lived, having one would have been perfect. The rest of the items in the listing didn't matter much to me. I just wanted those two. I messaged the seller, and our conversation was pretty normal at first. He was short with his replies, very direct, and weirdly easy to bargain with. He agreed to lower the price a little and said I could come pick everything up later that same night. In Oregon, during the summer, it stays light out pretty late, so I knew there'd still be a little sunlight by the time I got there. I assumed I'd probably need to make more than one trip for the sectional because of how big it was. Then I started driving out toward the address. The place was right on the coast. Before heading there, I checked the satellite view just to make sure it was an actual house, and it was. Based on the map, it looked like there was this long driveway or trail that curved away from the main road and opened up onto a huge property with a large house sitting near the edge of the land. Behind it was basically a straight drop to the ocean. My first thought was honestly, no wonder this stuff is cheap. If someone can afford a place like that, why wouldn't they just give half of it away? The farther I drove, the nicer the properties started getting. Eventually, I turned onto the final road before the driveway. That stretch was long and narrow, lined with woods on both sides, with only the occasional driveway branching off toward what I assumed were expensive cliffside homes. Then I found the turnoff. It was basically a dirt driveway disappearing through trees. About 10 seconds into driving down it, the woods opened into this huge clearing. The driveway sloped upward toward the house, which sat on top of a hill. I pulled in next to this old sedan, maybe a Mercury Sable or something like that. It looked completely out of place. The house looked like something a millionaire would own, and that car looked like it barely belonged on the road. I walked up to the front door ready to ring the bell, but stuck to the door was a yellow post-it note that said, "Doorbell broken, please use back door." That already felt a little odd because obviously I could have just knocked, but I followed the note anyway. As I walked along the porch, I sent the seller a message telling him I had arrived and was heading around back. I walked beside the house, glancing at the windows as I passed. Every blind was shut. When I got to the backyard, the view was unbelievable. The whole place looked straight out over the Pacific Ocean. I stepped up onto the deck and went to knock on the back sliding glass door, but there was some kind of sliding blind or shade covering it, so I couldn't see inside. I knocked once. Then I stood there waiting. After a minute, I knocked again. I checked my phone to see whether he had read my message or answered. Nothing. So I sat down in one of the deck chairs, turned it around, and just stared out at the sunset over the water. It felt surreal being there. I kept checking Messenger and sending follow-up messages, but still got nothing back. I triple-checked the address to make sure I wasn't at the wrong place, but I wasn't, and the note on the front door had confirmed it anyway. Eventually, I figured if he was in the shower or tied up doing something inside, I might as well walk closer to the cliff and take in the view. So I did. I stepped off the deck and walked across the grass toward the cliffside. The lawn looked freshly cut, and the whole place was so nice it almost didn't feel real. Standing there looking out over the ocean, I caught myself daydreaming about what it would be like to afford a house like that one day. Then I turned around to head back. I had only taken maybe 3 steps when I stopped. Every single blind in the house was open now, and there was a person standing at every window. They were completely still. At first, I honestly thought it had to be some kind of prank. I walked a little closer, still trying to make sense of it, and then I realized every face was smiling. I genuinely couldn't tell if they were real people or mannequins. That's how still they were. That was enough for me. I remember saying out loud, "Nope, I've seen enough." Then I started heading for my truck. I moved fast around the side of the house, and when I passed the side window I had seen earlier with the blinds shut, that one was open now too, and there was someone standing there. At that point, I didn't care what was going on. I just needed to leave. I got back into my truck and didn't even bother looking up at the front windows. I didn't want to know if there were people standing there too. I reversed the whole way back down the driveway. At one point, curiosity got the better of me and I looked toward the house. The front door was open now, and there was a man standing on the porch with his hands in his pockets, just watching me leave.
I didn't slow down. I got out of there as fast as I could. The seller still hadn't responded to my messages. I ended up pulling into the nearest neighbor's driveway and knocking on the door. The man who answered, I'll call him Tom, listened while I explained everything I'd just seen. I pressed him hard for any information about the people next door. Tom looked genuinely confused and a little alarmed because he told me he was close friends with the owner of that house and that the guy was almost never in town. He also said there was no way his neighbor would set up some elaborate prank like that. Then he called his neighbor right in front of me. From what I remember, the conversation went something like this. Hey Tom, it's Jim from next door. I've got a guy here saying he invited him over to buy some stuff, but that there were people standing in all your windows trying to scare him. There was a pause. Then Tom put me on the phone, and I explained everything. The Facebook listing, the messages, getting there, the people standing at the windows, the guy on the porch, the weird sedan parked outside. The owner immediately sounded concerned. He told me he wasn't even in town that week. I gave him every detail I could remember, including what the man on the porch looked like and the kind of car parked outside. He asked me to save his number and said he'd follow up after the police checked the house. After that, I went home. Truthfully, I didn't have it in me to spend the next couple hours involved in a police situation that technically didn't have anything to do with me. But later that night, the homeowner called me back. He asked me to send him the Facebook Marketplace listing, but by then it had already been removed. I sent him the info for the profile I'd been messaging through Messenger, but that account had already gone blank. He thanked me and said he'd still pass everything to the police. When I asked what they found, he told me there didn't appear to be anything missing from the house, at least as far as he knew at that point. The blinds had all been shut again, the old sedan was gone, but all 3 doors to the house had been left unlocked. And that's the part that still bothers me most. The way those people stood in the windows, smiling, like they were trying to lure me or scare me, or maybe both. I still wonder what they wanted me for, and why it seemed so important to get me behind the house. I don't know the answer. I just know I'm lucky I trusted my gut and left.
I lived with my parents in Murraysville, Pennsylvania. One weekend, my parents were away, so I decided to have a few people over for a small pool party in the backyard. We have an in-ground pool back there and a pool house, which makes the backyard pretty perfect for something like that, even though I don't usually get many chances to throw parties. The yard itself is laid out with the pool, a small grassy area, and then a stretch of woods behind the pool house. It's a really private backyard. That part matters. The party was supposed to be Saturday night. Earlier that day, I was outside setting everything up. It was cloudy, but since the party was going to be at night anyway, I didn't really care. The woods behind the pool house go back pretty far, at least half a mile before they hit another property. There are no walking trails through there, no reason for anyone to be back there, and that whole section is part of our property. I was carrying folding tables outside for beer pong and drinks when I heard a cough come from the woods. It wasn't a little cough either. It was one of those slow, throat-clearing coughs, like someone trying to get something unstuck, and it was definitely a man. I froze with the table still in my hands. I just stood there, listening. There wasn't much wind, so the sound carried clearly. It came from just inside the tree line, not deep in the woods, close enough that whoever made it definitely could have seen me. I slowly set the table down and stared toward the trees. Confused doesn't even really cover what I felt. Unsettled is better. Nobody should have been in those woods. I scanned the tree line and called out, "Who's there?" Nothing answered. No movement, no footsteps, no branches snapping. That somehow felt worse. If it had been some random person cutting through, I should have heard them leave. Instead, it was just dead quiet. I got that awful feeling in my chest, like someone was standing perfectly still behind one of the trees, watching me. I stayed there listening for maybe 20 seconds. The longer I stood there, the more uncomfortable I got. Eventually, I grabbed the rest of the stuff and brought it back inside for a while. I didn't want to be out there alone anymore.
I called my friend Mark and asked him to come earlier than planned to help me finish setting up. I didn't tell him about the cough. I didn't want to sound paranoid before the party even started. Mark showed up around 6 o'clock with some drinks, and we finished everything setting up together. I kept sneaking looks toward the woods while we were outside, but everything looked normal. Nothing moved. If someone had been there earlier, they were gone now. Everyone else started arriving between 7 and 8. At the busiest point, there were about 20 people there. Nothing wild, just a decent-sized group. Music was playing, people were in the pool, patio lights were on, and with that many people around, the woods stopped feeling creepy. Still, a few times that night, I caught myself glancing toward the tree line. I didn't even know why. That cough had just stayed with me. Things started winding down around midnight, and by 1 a.m. the last guests had gone home. I figured I'd deal with the cleanup the next day. I was exhausted and ready for bed. Before going inside, I did one last slow walk around the backyard. I went around the pool, checked behind the pool house, and looked out toward the woods one more time. Everything seemed fine. The water in the pool was calm. The patio lights reflected off it. No one was out there. So I locked the back sliding door and went upstairs to get ready for bed. I laid in bed scrolling on my phone for maybe half an hour before putting it down. Then I spent another half hour or so trying to fall asleep before I heard a splash. It wasn't a little splash. It sounded exactly like someone jumping into the deep end. My eyes opened instantly. I stayed still and listened. A few seconds later, I heard swimming. Actual strokes cutting through the water. My first thought was maybe somebody from the party had somehow stayed behind as a joke, or came back drunk and decided to mess with me. But I knew everyone who had been there, and none of them would do something like that. I texted everyone who had come to the party, asking if they had stayed behind, or seen anyone else hanging around. Anyone still awake said no. The rest answered the next morning and said no too. It was a complete stranger. And I'm convinced the cough I heard in the woods earlier that day came from that same man. I still don't know how he got the door unlocked. Maybe he slipped in during the party when people were going in and out of the house. As for why he came back, I have no idea. I just know that if I hadn't woken up when I did, or if I had opened that bedroom door, I don't know what would have happened to me.